All right, so to get started, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go around the motor, making sure all of the harness is disconnected from whatever it's connected to. At this time, I can tell you right now that my fuel rails have already been disconnected and removed. And as I stated before, what's holding the fuel rails to the intake manifold or the intake manifold are 4 8mm bolts, which can remove by an 8mm wrench or an 8mm socket with a ratchet. And this is what they look like. All right, there's 4 of them. So the only things right now that my harness is connected to is my coil pack and the throttle body, and maybe the camshaft sensors is still connected. So at this time, I'm just going to go ahead and start removing that stuff. What I'm going to use in order to help me remove that is a flathead screwdriver, just this tip portion. I'm going to use that to press up against the tab to either push or pull that tab. And when removing the connector, I'm going to grab the connector by its body and then disconnect it that way. You never want to tug on the wires to that connector, because you could pull those wires or depin it or strip those wires, and that's going to lead down to more issues down the road. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So for those of you guys who don't know, there's a connector that's being held on to the throttle body, part of the throttle body, and that connector has a safety tab. What you want to do with that safety tab is you want to pull that red safety tab towards you and then push down on the tab and grab the connector by the body and pull that towards you in order to get that off. That's how you disconnect that one. I'm just gonna go ahead and get all this out of my way. All right, so now that everything has been disconnected, all wiring, all connectors have been removed from whatever it's connected to. So there is some things like studs. The wiring harness is connected to some of the studs, and usually it's just like a little plastic clip that pushes down into the stud. You can sometimes you can easily just use your finger to pull up on that tab, or you can also use a tool like this here in order to get a better grip or a better leverage on it and remove it that way. There's a few that's like that I'm going to go ahead and remove that way. I'm going to use the tool to remove this one here. This is fairly simple. Pops right off. All right, so everything is good. Once you disconnect the wiring harness from everything that it's connected to, for this vehicle, I can only vouch for this vehicle, the 2005 to 2009 Ford Mustang GT. Once you remove the engine from the engine bay, the whole entire wiring harness comes with it. So once you disconnect everything from the coil pack, the fuel rail, the throttle body, the camshaft sensor, things of that nature right there, once you disconnect the wiring harness, the wiring harness will just drop away from the engine block. All right, it's not a bad thing. The way I'm going to go about doing it is I'm going to keep it oriented in a way that it goes, so that when I place the new motor after being rebuilt back into the bay, I can go ahead and connect everything up. All right, so the next thing we're going to go ahead and remove is the intake manifold. All right, again, as I stated before, this intake manifold is being held down by 10 millimeter bolt. You will need a extension to get to the bolts that's within the inside of the intake. All right, and I'm going to show you I'm going to show you guys those. All right, so these are the 10 millimeter bolts that is holding down the intake manifold, and the ones that's going to need the extension to be reached are, let's see if it focuses there, one there, and then there is one on the other side of the intake manifold, basically in the same position. Let's see, one there. All right, let's get started removing the intake manifold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and completely remove them now, or not completely remove them. Normally for me, in order to keep the exact order where the bolts come from, I just remove them enough to where they wiggle around within their home. That way, that also ensures that every bolt goes right back into the same home that it came from. The 2 bolts that's on the inside, I use a magnet in order to retrieve those bolts. Or if I can finagle it with my fingertips, I'll just use those in order to remove the intake manifold from its resting place. Okay, now that all the bolts have been turned loose, what I'm gonna do now, and what I like to do, is I like to lift up on them to make sure they actually are not securing the intake manifold to the block anymore. Good. See, there's one here that was still secured to the block. Okay, now that's good. All right, so in order to remove this intake manifold, the way I do it is I like to grab from the throttle body, and I grab the rear of the intake manifold. I start to lift up. If something catches, I stop, sit it back down. I kind of shimmy it left to right, and I go for it again, lift up. And there it goes. Intake manifold has been removed from the block. I sit that to the side so as not to damage it. Again, the bolt is still in the intake manifold. It's holding it place because that way I can ensure every bolt goes back into the same home that it came out of. All right. Now that that has been removed, the next place of business is the removing the alternator and the alternator bracket. All right, once you remove your intake manifold, this is what you'll be looking at. As you can see the inside of your valley. Over the years, there's broken plastic that'll drop off in here. There is broken or all sorts of debris, sand, dirt, whatever that may be in there. So what I like to do is I like to take blue painter's tape, and I run the blue painter's tape across all the openings in order to keep any debris from falling in there, whether now or in the future. Also, a lot of people, I've seen people use plastic shopping bags. They use the red cleanup rags or shop rags. They stuff down in there. Me personally, it's just easy to use blue painter's tape. You slide it across there, seal it down, and call it a day. And also, I'll vacuum out the valley of the block, which I have already done. Another thing I want to point out to you guys is if you're looking for your knock sensors, you have 2 of them. There's one here and there's one there. So the best thing to do is, if you're going to use this block again, I would go ahead and replace those now because you have access to them. Another issue is this this coolant passage here. There is an incident where I was smelling coolant. I couldn't find it. I ended up using a flashlight one day, and I came and looked down into my the valley of my motor. There was a whole puddle of coolant sitting right here in this valley. And what happened was, over time, heat gets trapped in here. So the original hole, the original pieces become brittle and break over time. I replaced this hose from Napa. Got the right size hose, slid it on there, and I used these 2 clamps to lock it down. and I haven't had an issue since replacing it. This is the original connector, however. This is another point of failure because it's plastic, so eventually over time heat will get to it and it will break. So if you guys just hang on a minute, I'm going to go ahead and cover these openings with blue painter's tape, as I stated before. That way there's no debris that can fall into this motor while I'm working. All right, y'all, I'm actually going to backtrack here because I forgot there's two tubes connected to your intake manifold. This tube here is connected to your intake manifold, and it's also connected to the driver's side valve cover. This tube, which is an evap tube, is connected to your intake manifold and your evap purge system. One end of this tube will be already disconnected because you have to disconnect it in order to remove the motor completely from the engine bay. The best way to remove it is on this end, or on each end, you have a white tab that can be decompressed either using the fingernail of your thumb or whichever finger you choose that you usually use, or like I use a flathead screwdriver. I decompress this white push down and then I wiggle that completely off. Once that's removed, you can go ahead and set that to the side. The other tube, the vent tube, that's connected to your intake manifold and your driver's side valve cover. How to remove this is there's green tabs on each side. You push up on the green tab and push to whichever side is free, and you wiggle that off, and that goes for both ends. All right, so now that I have backtracked and corrected that, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to start to remove my alternator and my bracket. My alternator and my bracket, or my alternator, is being held down by two 10mm bolts. You guys probably have four 10mm bolts. I've done some work and swapped out alternators in this vehicle before, and as you all know, if you work on your vehicles, all bolts don't always make it back to where they go. So I'll have two. So I'm going to go ahead and get that started. Don't necessarily need the extension still, but I'm going to use it because I don't feel like detaching it. All right, that's one. Here's two. All right, the alternator is also held in by two 13mm bolts. In order to remove those bolts, you are going to need a 13mm deep socket. Technically what it is bolts that's threaded onto a stud, and the alternator just sits on those studs. All right, go ahead and remove that now. Bracket is coming off. Just gonna go ahead and sit that there for now. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and lift up the alternator. All right, now that the alternator is free, there is a connector on the back of the alternator. In case you guys do not know or never swapped out an alternator, there is a connector. Again, you can use a flathead screwdriver or your thumb to decompress the tab, grab the body connector, pull it away. There's another power source, or there's another cable that's running to your alternator. That is your power source. That is your power wire. That wire runs all the way to the positive side of your battery terminal. It is located on the back side of your alternator, and it is held down by a 10mm bolt or 10mm nut. I'm going to go ahead and remove that now. All right, it's good to go. Remove the wire. Once you remove the wire, like I said, your harness should drop on its own. That is fine. It's not connected to anything. For me, I like to keep control of my bolts. So normally I put them back where they come from, which is their home, or for my socket or for my nuts, I also rethread those back onto where they go. You guys probably got a laugh out of that, huh? All right, so with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and sit this to the side. I'm gonna put this on the shelf with my other parts that I removed. It is labeled 064 Mustang GT. Reason being is because in my parts cabinet, I have other parts from other vehicles, and I want to make sure I put the right part back onto the right block. Just gonna sit that to the side. All right, you all. Just so you guys can get a better look, the alternator normally sits here. I just removed it from this space. It sits on top of these two studs and is held down by two 13mm nuts that basically backs all the way down or threads all the way down up against the alternator from the bottom. And then the alternator bracket rests here and here, and that is held down by two 10mm bolts. And there's also two 10mm bolts on that same bracket that's threaded into your alternator. As you guys can see, I already laid down the blue tape along those openings to keep any or to prevent any debris from falling into the engine block. All right, you all. Parts that was removed during this video was parts of the harness that was still connected, the intake manifold, which was held down by 10mm bolts, the alternator bracket, which is held down by mine, two 10mm bolts. Yours should be four 10mm bolts, the evap tube, and the vent tube. I have also laid down blue painter's tape across all openings to prevent debris from falling into the block. Now that I have removed a few parts, this will complete the first episode. In the next video, I will be removing the following parts: the coil packs, the spark plugs, both valve covers, both headers, the timing cover, and maybe the timing chain. I will also be ensuring as much of the oil has been drained as possible. I will be removing the oil filter and maybe the oil pan. For those of you who have pulled a motor before, how do you normally go about getting her done? Do you pull both motor and transmission at the same time? Or do you separate the motor from the transmission? Leave your answers in the comments below. I'm curious to see how you all get her done. Until next time.